Hi again then guys, and welcome to episode 9 of B-Road Ballers, the review series for the hot hatches, old and new, that are featured of course on GT6. And in this episode we're featuring pretty much the vehicle that started it all really, the car that really put hot hatches on the map, the first generation Volkswagen Golf GTi. By today's standards, it's not that amazing on paper, even fully tuned. That's probably not too surprising. However, how does it compare to modern vehicles in its actual racing potential, the fun, the usability it has, the performance it has, and also, perhaps more importantly, against vehicles of its age? And on that point, putting this car up against modern hot hatches isn't completely fair, because although this series discusses hot hatches from a wide variety of eras, putting a car from 1976 up against an R32 or a Mk.1 GTi or a Focus ST, that's just not fair. Of course it doesn't stand a chance against those cars. If it had an engine swap to give it, say, 500 horsepower, then it might, but it doesn't. So of course I would be lying if I was to tell you that this car could outrun the modern hot hatch lineup. That would be ridiculous. In real life, with certain tuning, it could. On the game, that's just not possible yet. Now that said, the performance that it does have is very respectable, especially for its slightly uninspiring on-paper specs. Now fully tuned, this Golf puts out 262 horsepower, which is only around the same as a stock Mark 6 Golf R. So again, against the modern rivals, it's just not a fair comparison. It's got a 1.6 litre turbo engine driving the front wheels, whereas the modern Golfs are going more towards all-wheel drive. Again, not a fair comparison. But it's extremely light. It only weighs 719 kilos. So despite not having a massive amount of power, it doesn't really need a massive amount of power. And on the subject of being lightweight and not needing huge power, the torque figure isn't particularly high either. It's 204 pound-feet. But again, it doesn't need a huge amount of torque. It's like a motorbike. It has hardly any weight to move, a rev-happy engine, great at keeping up a high average speed through the corners due to its very compact size, nimble handling and low weight. And because it just doesn't need that much torque going through a front-wheel drive chassis, that would be suicide. And speaking of impressive specs, it actually has a pretty decent power-to-weight ratio. It doesn't have a huge amount of power, but it also doesn't have much weight, so the power-to-weight ratio per tonne is still a pretty respectable 364. And the PP, perhaps surprising the most of all of its specs, is 505. That's pretty high considering its specs. That's not far off some of the modern hot hatches in terms of PP. Certainly far closer in terms of PP than it is in terms of power, where it's around half of the power of some of its modern rivals. Indirect rivals, of course. Now the price is pretty amazing, to be honest. I'm not sure why they made this car so cheap on the game, because it's not like it's not historically important. It's pretty much the most historically important hot hatch in the game. And it only costs 15 grand, which is pretty insane. I mean, yeah, it's not Le Mans prototype level of performance, but still, it's a very historically important vehicle with great potential within its niche. Now, speaking of its niche, what is that niche? Because as we already said, it can't really put up much of a fight against, say, a 400 or 500 horsepower modern hot hatch, regardless of whether they have all-wheel drive. Well, I would say that this car's niche is actually against other classics, and not necessarily just hot hatches, actually just classics in general. And the reason why I'd say that is because many classic vehicles, and this is actually a reason why the Golf stood out so much back in the day, back in the 70s, vehicles, even high-performance vehicles in general, did not have very good handling. So the Golf really blew people away by how good it was. And that hasn't changed. Many of the classic vehicles on the game can be outperformed by this little, relatively underpowered Golf. This can give classic Ferraris, classic Lambos, vehicles which on paper it should have no chance of keeping up with a great run for their money on the track. So, as a roundup, if you're looking for a pure hot hatch racing machine, of course it doesn't stand a chance against modern hot hatches. On some tracks, like city tracks or extremely tight technical tracks, it might come close. But against a decent driver in a modern hot hatch, it's never going to win. It just doesn't have the tools necessary. Against classics, or just for fun driving, fast fun driving, or even cruising, it's a great little car, and due to the aforementioned historical significance, it's a pretty much essential collector's piece for fans of hot hatches. So all in all, it's so cheap that I can't really not recommend it. It's a really fun, fantastic handling little car. So give it a try. And that's it for this review. So I'll see you guys next time, and as always, thanks for watching.